So we've learned quite a bit about the JavaScript language at this point. Now we're going to move on to how we actually interact with things in our browser. So JavaScript's major purpose for our class, at least, will be to manipulate things in the browser, manipulate objects, change behavior, define interactivity, and eventually communicate with our server directly. So when you want to put JavaScript in your HTML, there are really two major ways that you see this happen. One is you can use a script element and you can put JavaScript right into the HTML page. You can just start writing JavaScript code, and HTML, when your browser encounters that script element, it knows that it needs to parse and interpret and execute that JavaScript code. So it will just do that, line by line, and it will run what you need. And that's a pretty common way to do a lot of things. But once your code gets bigger and bigger and bigger, sometimes it makes more sense to use a script element and reference an external JavaScript file. So in that file, you define nothing but JavaScript. You can write your functions, build classes, everything that you need to operate your page can go in that file. Now, one thing that is useful to know is that sometimes manually putting a version of that file, marking it with a number, can be useful. There is a lot of caching that happens. Sometimes you'll set settings in your server. Sometimes you'll set settings in the page itself that will cause files to be cached. And a really easy way to just sort of force a new version is to just update that number. So if you name your script file script001.js and you change things, you might actually want to change it to script002.js and reference a new file. That way you can be sure that your code is going to operate as you expect. A very common problem once people start writing code in the browser is that they change something and they don't see the behavior change when they're trying to test it. So they change it again and they don't see the behavior change. And what's actually happening sometimes is that file is cached in the browser and you're just running the same old file. You're making changes, but those aren't actually picking up. You're still running that same old version. So forcing it using this renaming is just a nice little trick to have in your pocket if you need to actually make sure that the changes you made are going to be reloaded. Because as far as your browser is concerned, script001.js and script002.js and script171.js are all entirely different files that have no relation to each other whatsoever. So it will look for those anew whenever you change that. Now, when you use a script element, very straightforward. You create you just call the element script, and it used to be common to set the language to JavaScript, but nowadays I don't think that anybody really does that. Back when Internet Explorer came up, VB script, and you might actually have different types of scripting languages supported by different browsers. That was more common. I haven't seen script a language attribute in a script tag for a very long time. So you just create a script element. You then enter JavaScript code. So here we have script, and then you can see we create a variable, we assign the value 5 to it, we log a message, and if you look at your JavaScript console in your browser, you'll see that message whenever this script element is loaded, and that's really all there is to it. So it's pretty basic, pretty straightforward, pretty easy to write JavaScript code in this way. Using a source attribute will allow you to link to an external file, and again, this can be really useful as your code grows and grows and grows. Sometimes it's nice to just have everything in a single file or in a set of files. So the only difference here is that you have an SRC, a source attribute, for where your script file is located, and then there's you typically don't put anything within your script element, and then in your script.js, that's where you would actually define your code. So your browser will then pull that JavaScript file in and load it, and then you can actually run your JavaScript code that way. So we have something in HTML in your browser called the document object model, and the document object model is basically taking all of the HTML elements and attributes and building objects out of those, and your browser will hold this this object model, and as you manipulate that object model, it will be reflected in the rendering of your page. So there are really easy ways to start manipulating the document object model. We usually refer to this as the DOM. One of the easiest ways is to give your element an ID. So in your element you can have an ID attribute, and then in JavaScript you can retrieve that element as an object just by using document.getElementById and then refer to that particular ID. Once you have that, that's now an object that you can manipulate in a variety of different ways. A really simple thing you can do is set new inner HTML on that object, which if that's a div element, for example, then the content of that div element will be set to whatever you like it to be. In this case, we will just change that text, but that could actually be interpretable HTML as well. So this, and you can see in this second example, in this case, we're actually retrieving a different element by its ID, and then we're setting its value to HTML, or to an HTML string that has some formatting in it. So this is probably the most basic way to change the content of your page, just using this really simple call, document.getElementById. And there's actually a lot of different things you can do to that element once you have it programmatically. But we'll explore more and more of those options as we move through the class. So once you can do this, one of the ways you will do it is through events. And JavaScript is very event-driven in your browser. So basically what event-driven means is that there are different events. Like one event is that the page is loaded. One event is that there is a response to communication. One event is that the user has moved their mouse into something. One event is that the user has clicked on something. So there's a lot of different events that you will encounter. And you can create JavaScript functions to respond to each one of these, or you can add event handlers to respond to each one of these. And it allows you to create code that then does something in response to a user event, and sometimes even triggers its own events. So an event is something that happens that your code can respond to. So if the application is opened, the user clicks a button, a user moves their mouse. If there's a message received, by the application or by your script, through browser's communication. If the window's resized, you can get this. You can, if a component receives the focus, like you click into a text box, or if some data is changed, there are a variety of things that you can do that will trigger events, and these allow you to do something in response using your code. So probably the simplest and easiest and a very common thing you might want to do is handle a click. And the simplest way to do this is in your button element, you can have an onClick attribute. And what this does is it allows you to execute some JavaScript function. And here we're just naming a JavaScript function that is called every time somebody clicks this button. So now what this will render is you will now have a button on the screen. And when someone clicks this button, it will call some function. And that's probably the simplest, easiest way to interact with the user in the browser using JavaScript. And you can do this a couple of different ways. You can also use an input element, and it has the same onClick attribute that will set this some other function to respond to whenever someone clicks that button. You can also do it in JavaScript. If you want to do, if you want to set the onClick handler, you can use document.getElementById, then retrieve that particular attribute by its ID, and then set the onClick handler to some new function that you can declare in line. And there's a lot more you can do with that. We're going to explore some of these capabilities as this class goes on. Some other common events that you can create a simple handler for, on blur, which is when you move out of an element. So for example, you click on a text box, but then you click on another text box. We call that a blur event. When an element changes, so if you change something about the element, if you change some of the values there, when you get an element focus, so if you click on that particular element, like if you click into a text area or into a text box, on load, which is when an element is loaded on the page. You can also handle different mouse events, like when a mouse moves into the element, when your mouse cursor moves into an element, or when a mouse cursor leaves that element. Those are also different events that you can handle. There's a whole bunch of examples. We'll walk through those in a demonstration. So this will allow you to kind of see this in practice. Some of this, just talking about it only takes you so far. But when you get into it and you start running the code and you start organizing the way the code operates and try it yourself, this can be a really effective way to start getting into JavaScript. So we'll take a look at that in the next video. But for now, thanks for watching. And I hope you're starting to get into this and start getting into the idea of manipulating your user experience using JavaScript. Thanks for watching.